11:15 in the morning, December the 12th, 1908. Bas Obispo, deep inside the Culebra Cut. 25 tons of dynamite, meant to let go in careful stages. Let's go all at once. 26 men are dead before the dust settles. 49 more are dragged out broken. 45,000 men built the Panama Canal. 5,600 of them didn't live to see it finished. That number sits on plaques now, printed in textbooks like it's the whole truth. It is not the whole truth. It's the number somebody in an office decided was worth writing down. Picture a 9-mile gash cut straight through a mountain range, wide enough to lay 130 football fields end to end, deep enough to swallow a 10-story building standing on its end. 95-ton steam shovels crawled its floor day and night. Locomotives ran through it stacked with broken rock, and men worked on foot in the gaps between all that iron, every day, for a decade. They called it Hell's Gorge, not as a figure of speech. Here's what the plaque leaves out. Nobody running this project ever set out to build an honest count of what it cost. And almost every man it did cost was the same kind of man. A black laborer from the Caribbean, paid less than a third of what the man beside him took home for staying dry. So the real question was never how many died. It's how many died that nobody in charge bothered to write down. And why? The facts they didn't put on the plaque start with the number itself. 5,609 dead, by the official count, and of those, roughly 4,500 were non-white, mostly West Indian. 350 were white Americans. The ratio alone should stop you. These men were never dying in equal measure. They were dying on a schedule that tracked almost exactly with their pay grade. And the pay grade had a name. 2 names, actually. Gold roll, silver roll. One paid in American gold-backed dollars. The other paid in local silver coin, worth less than half as much for the same 10-hour day. We'll get to exactly how that system worked and who it protected. For now, just sit with this. It wasn't a policy quietly applied somewhere in a back office. It ran through every window, every mess hall line, every hospital ward on the isthmus. Barbados sent men by the tens of thousands. By the time the canal was finished, the recruitment had pulled something like 40% of the island's working-age men across the water. The island's population dropped by nearly 30,000 people in a single decade. An entire generation of a small Caribbean nation gone to go dig a ditch for a country that wasn't theirs. Up at the locks, where the concrete chambers rose 8 stories into the air, riveters worked the high scaffolding with no harness of any kind. One wrong shift of weight, and the platform came loose. When it did, whatever fell hit the scaffolding below on the way down, and took that crew with it too. Nobody up there was clipped to anything. That was simply how the job got done, 8 stories up, for years. And here's one nobody expects. The deadliest disease on this project, year after year, wasn't the one with its name on every poster warning men away from the tropics. Yellow fever got the headlines. Malaria got the funding. But pneumonia was the single leading killer of the American construction era, every single year of it, and it barely rates a mention in most of what's been written about this place since. We'll get to why that particular disease had such an easy run. At Ancon Hospital, between 1910 and 1912 alone, doctors logged 22,000 surgical cases. More than 11,500 of them were classified as trauma, blast injuries, fractures, amputations, cuts from machinery, falls. This wasn't an occasional bad week on the job site. This was the baseline. Then there's the letter. A trainman, injured on the job, wrote to the canal administrators in the spring of 1913, begging, in his own hand, in his own spelling, for a pair of artificial legs, after a train took both of his. He wasn't owed anything, not legally. Officials decided his injury was his own fault, which was the standard finding, and the standard finding meant the company owed him nothing at all. We'll come back to him. His name is on record, and so is what happened to him, and it's worse than you're picturing, and it's more complicated than you're picturing, both at once. And under all of it sits the number that isn't on any plaque. how many of the dead never made it into the official ledger in the first place, because the Canal Zone kept its own hospital records and its own death registry, and thousands of these men didn't live inside the Canal Zone at all. They lived in Panama City, in Colón, outside the line the bookkeepers drew. If a man died out there, of a fever that wasn't even on the list of causes the commission bothered to track, there's a real chance he was never counted as one of the 5,609 at all. That's the shape of what's coming. 45,000 men. A death toll that's a floor, not a ceiling. A pay system built to decide, in advance, whose life cost less. And one very specific question sitting underneath all of it. How many of these men actually vanished from the record entirely? And why did the people running this project have every reason to let that happen? Where Colón man went to die. By 1904, the man who wanted the job in Panama already had a legend to chase, and the legend had a name, Colón man. Decades earlier, workers who'd gone to labor on the Panama Railroad or the French Canal attempt had occasionally come home to Barbados or Jamaica with money in their pockets, dressed sharp, and the story of the man who went to Panama and came back rich outlived every man who went to Panama and didn't come back at all. Recruiters for the new American project knew exactly which story to sell. The contract they waived in front of a prospective laborer asked for a fair amount up front. He had to be in good health. He had to be able to read and write. He had to be willing to put in 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, under a sun that didn't let up and a rain that came without warning. In exchange, free passage across the water and the promise of a paid trip home again once he'd logged roughly 500 working days on the isthmus. Recruiters fanned out hardest across Barbados, and it worked. By the end of the first big recruitment year, 1 in every 5 men on the payroll was Barbadian. Some of them arrived the way most of them arrived, packed onto the open deck of a steamship, not below decks in a cabin, because deck passage was cheaper, and the Isthmian Canal Commission was recruiting on a budget. One ship alone, the Ancon, brought some 1,500 Barbadian men across in a single crossing in 1909, crowded shoulder to shoulder in the open air the entire way, salt and coal smoke and no shelter from the weather. Men who made that crossing called themselves deckers and wore it like the first badge of the job, before they'd even swung a pick. What they got on arrival was a barracks bunk, a 10-hour day at 10 cents an hour, and a jungle that had already killed tens of thousands of men during the failed French effort 2 decades earlier. The old graveyards were still there. Nobody hid them. The new recruits walked past them on the way to their first shift. Every single one of these men had already passed a health screening to even get on that boat. The ones who filled the hospital wards and the death ledgers over the next 10 years weren't the sickly exceptions the recruiters worried about turning away. They were the healthy men the commission had hand-picked as fit enough to survive it. That's who this project was actually killing. But the promise that mattered most, the one written into the whole architecture of the Canal Zone before a single West Indian worker set foot on the isthmus, was the roll system. Gold roll, silver roll. On paper it was a payroll classification. In practice, it was a color line with a currency symbol stapled to it. Gold roll employees, overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly American, were paid in United States dollars, backed by gold. They got individual housing, screened against mosquitoes. They got paid vacation. They got pensions waiting at the far end of their contract. Silver roll employees, the West Indian laborers who made up the overwhelming bulk of the workforce along with Panamanian and other non-white workers, were paid in local silver currency worth roughly half the gold rate for the same hour of labor. They lived in crowded barracks, ate worse food at higher prices, and their children, when they had them on the isthmus, went to separate and unequal schools. No pensions, no vacation, just the job, for as long as your body could still do it. This wasn't hidden. It ran through the commissary lines, the hospital wards, even the drinking fountains. And it wasn't only about race in the abstract. It decided who lived and who didn't, because gold roll workers were funneled toward supervisory posts, and skilled trades kept largely out of the blast radius. while silver roll gangs did the excavation itself, the drilling, the loading, the work inside Culebra Cut, where the dynamite went off, and the trains ran, and the mountain came down without warning. Keep that roll system in mind, because it's the reason the number on the plaque is a floor and not a total. A gold roll death got a name, a file, and a place in the official record almost automatically. A silver roll death had to survive being noticed first, and plenty didn't. We're a long way from done with what that difference actually cost. Even workers who weren't West Indian felt the weight of it. Roughly 8,000 laborers were recruited out of Spain between 1906 and 1908, promised comfortable housing and good food in the recruitment pamphlets. They found neither. Spanish workers were paid twice what West Indian silver roll men earned, and they still organized strikes against the segregated system they'd been dropped into, proof of how load-bearing the two-tier structure was to the entire project. Black American citizens who tried their luck on the canal ran into the same wall from a different angle. Enough of them protested the conditions and the pay gap that, within a few years, canal authorities simply stopped hiring black citizens of the United States outright. By 1909, they were almost entirely gone from the workforce. The silver roll was, by design, going to stay a workforce with no political leverage back home to make any noise about it. So, this is who came to build the canal. Men chased across an ocean by the ghost of Colon Man, signed onto a pay scale that had already decided, before they picked up a single shovel, how much their labor and their lives were worth. Somewhere in a filing cabinet, a clerk was already deciding which of these men would count, when the time came to count the dead. That clerk's math starts showing its seams the moment you walk into the cut itself. 9 miles of ground that wanted them dead. The cut didn't care what roll you were on. Culebra Cut ran roughly 9 miles through the spine of the Continental Divide, and every foot of it had to be blasted, dug, and hauled out by hand and by machine, together, at the same time, in the same space. This was the choke point of the entire project. Nearly half of all the excavation on the American side of the canal happened inside this one stretch of ground. Twice a day, work stopped so more than 600 holes packed with dynamite could be fired at once. In some blasts, better than 20 tons of explosive went off in a single detonation. All told, over the life of the project, workers packed and fired something like 60 million pounds of dynamite into this mountain range. And dynamite in a tropical climate does not behave the way dynamite behaves in a manual. The humidity got into it. Sulfur compounds inside the blasted rock reacted with air and moisture to generate their own heat. Engineers came to call it hot rock, hot enough, on its own, to set off a charge nobody had touched. A steam shovel's bucket could strike an unexploded charge left behind from an earlier blast, and set off a chain reaction with no warning at all. Once, lightning struck a detonator wire directly and touched off a 12-ton charge that killed 7 men outright. Go back to that morning at Bas Obispo. Shot holes had been drilled deep into the rock, 4 to 6 sticks of dynamite packed into each one. Dozens of them wired together into a single firing pattern meant to bring down one measured section of the mountain at a time. That was the plan. Crews were still working the last of the holes when the ground let go early, and instead of one controlled section coming down, something closer to 25 tons of packed explosive detonated together, in one single instant. Men working the face had no seconds to react, let alone run. The blast threw rock and bodies across the cut, and buried equipment under debris 20 to 30 feet deep in places. What followed was hours of men digging by hand and by lantern, calling out names, pulling their own co-workers out of ground that had been solid rock that morning. For years, the official position from the men running the project was that premature blasts like this one were the fault of careless labor, sloppy workers, not sound engineering. It took decades for that explanation to fully unravel. Once later engineers worked out what the humidity and the chemistry were actually doing to stored explosive sitting in wet tropical rock for hours before it was meant to fire. But in the file on Bas Obispo, The report that got written up blamed the crew. That's the debt from the opening of this video, and here's the first payment on it. The December blast came down to a known physical hazard of storing explosive in wet tropical rock, a hazard the engineering side was still arguing about internally years after the men who'd been buried by it were already dead. Sabotage never entered into it. Neither did drink, or a careless hand on a fuse. 26 men never got up again. 49 more carried pieces of that morning in their bodies for the rest of their lives, and the crew got blamed for it in writing anyway. But the dynamite wasn't even the strangest way this ground killed people. Malaria was the other war being fought here, alongside the excavation, and the frontline weapon against it was quinine, a bitter alkaloid dosed out to workers daily to suppress the parasite before it could take hold. It worked, mostly. It also came with a side effect that barely made it into the official health reports. Heavy, sustained quinine dosing could leave a man with reduced hearing, sometimes for hours at a stretch, sometimes for good. Now put that man back into the cut. Picture the actual floor of Culebra on an ordinary working day. Locomotives rolling in both directions on parallel tracks. Steam shovels grinding through rock a few yards off. Blasting crews shouting the warning before a charge went off. And underneath all of it, the low, constant roar that never fully stopped from 6 in the morning until the light gave out. A man with full hearing had to stay alert every second in that noise, just to place where the next train was coming from. A man whose hearing had been dulled by the very medicine keeping him alive from one disease had a much harder time hearing the one bearing down on him from an entirely different direction. One survivor, recalling those years afterward, remembered watching a fellow worker try to hop aboard a moving train and get cut in two by the wheels of a second one, coming the other way. It happened fast enough that nobody standing nearby had time to shout a warning that would have mattered anyway. That's not a story the recruitment posters mentioned. The medicine that was supposed to save these men from one killer quietly made them worse at surviving another, and nobody kept a ledger cross-referencing the two. Remember the debt from the top of this video, the one about pneumonia. Here's the payoff. And it starts with something the Canal Zone genuinely got right. Dr. William Gorgas ran a sanitation campaign here that actually worked. Draining swamps, oiling standing water, screening buildings against mosquitoes, fumigating homes where a case of yellow fever turned up. Yellow fever, which had helped kill tens of thousands during the earlier French effort, was effectively wiped out in the zone within a couple of years of the Americans taking the campaign seriously. That achievement is real, and it saved real lives, and it deserves to be said without an asterisk attached. But screens and drained swamps stop mosquitoes. They don't stop pneumonia, which spreads through crowding, exhaustion, and men packed into poorly ventilated barracks after a soaking 10-hour shift, which is exactly the housing Silver Roll workers were given, while Gold Roll employees lived in individual, mosquito-screened houses built to a different standard entirely. The screens went up fastest and stayed best maintained in the housing Gold Roll families lived in. Silver Roll barracks got less of that same attention, and for a disease that traveled through close, damp, poorly aired sleeping quarters rather than through mosquito bites, that gap mattered every bit as much as which side of the payroll a man was on. Malaria dropped. Yellow fever nearly vanished. Pneumonia just kept killing, year after year, in exactly the housing built for exactly the men doing the most dangerous work. A genuine public health triumph, sitting right next to a housing gap it was never designed to close. And the trains, more than the dynamite, more than the landslides, were the workhorse of death in this cut, because they were the least dramatic way to die, and that's exactly why the toll from them ran so high for so long without anyone treating it as a crisis. A dynamite blast made headlines. A man crushed stepping wrong onto a dirt car spoil train barely made a line in a hospital ledger. At Ancon Hospital, railroad mishaps alone accounted for hundreds of the trauma cases logged in just a 2-year span, on top of the thousands more from blasting and falls. Nobody stopped construction over a train death. It was Tuesday. Then it was Wednesday, and it happened again. Chief engineers privately admitted the rate of violent, accidental death on this project was excessive, particularly from the railroads, but the schedule never slowed down to fix it. The endless chain of trains, shovels, and dynamite crews was, by design, never supposed to stop moving. It didn't, even when it was killing the men running it. So that's the machinery of the cut. Dynamite that could go off on its own schedule. Medicine that dulled the one sense that might have saved you from a train, and a production line that had no interval built into it for grief. What that machinery did to a body, over 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, for years, is the next part of this, and it's where the man who wrote that letter about his legs comes back into the story. The man who had no claim coming to him. 6 in the morning, and you're already sweating before the whistle blows. You've been up since before the light, and the air is already thick enough to chew. 10 hours ahead of you, 6 days a week, in heat that sits somewhere north of 100 degrees by midday, with rain that can turn the ground under your boots to soup, with no warning at all. You didn't get a harness, or a hearing test, or a supervisor asking if you slept. You got a shovel, a work gang, and a foreman who needed the day's spoil total to match yesterday's. The hospital ledgers from these years use the same handful of words over and over for what this work did to a body. Crushed, mashed, amputated. Bruises and sprains barely rated a line. A head wound that only cost a man a day or two off work might have changed the rest of his life, and the record doesn't always say which. None of that was accidental in the sense of being unplanned. It was the plan. Silver roll gangs were the ones sent into the parts of the cut where the ground was worst and the machinery was thickest, because that's where the excavation actually happened, and excavation was the whole point of the 10 years. Somewhere in that grind, on an ordinary working day like any other, is where a train man named Wilfred MacDonald comes into this story, and where he stays with us for the rest of it. By his own account, MacDonald had been working trains since 1906. MacDonald worked for both the Isthmian Canal Commission and the Panama Railroad as what he called, in his own words, a train man. 6 years of it by 1912, when what he called his misfortune happened. He'd started on the job as little more than a boy, by some accounts around 15 years old, and stayed with it into his 20s. The record doesn't spell out the exact moment his misfortune came for him, only the outcome. He lost both of his legs, almost certainly the same way George Hodges's co-worker did, caught wrong between moving rail cars in a cut that ran trains constantly and gave a man no margin for a bad step or a slow reflex. Under the Commission's own rules, an injury caused by the worker's own negligence entitled him to nothing. And the default finding for nearly every injury on this project was negligence. Never the equipment, never the impossible pace of the work, never the deafening noise or the fact that quinine was quietly stealing men's hearing while the job demanded they listen for a train's whistle over the roar of shovels and blasting. MacDonald's case was closed on exactly that basis. More than a year passed between the accident and what came next. A year of getting by, however a man with no legs and no income manages to get by on an isthmus that had no real safety net built for him. Then, in May of 1913, MacDonald sat down and wrote directly to the Canal administrators himself. He wasn't a lettered man in the way the clerks reading his file were, and his spelling shows it on every line, but there is nothing unclear about what he was asking for. He laid out his service record first, year by year, like a man building a case, even though he'd already been told he had no case to build. Then he got to the reason for the letter. He had a widowed mother depending on him. He had motherless children depending on him. He wasn't claiming the Commission owed him anything. He said so plainly, in his own words, "I have no claim coming to me." All he wanted was a pair of legs to stand on, so he could go back to being the one thing he had left to offer his family, a provider, on his own 2 feet, even if they weren't the feet he'd started with. He was right that he had no claim. The Commission's own rules said so. But officials eventually agreed to provide him with artificial limbs anyway. not because the law required it, but because they judged he'd otherwise become what the record calls a public charge, a burden the administration would rather quietly absorb than be seen ignoring outright. And in granting it, they made a point of writing down that his case was not to be treated as a precedent, a favor, handed down once, to one man, and specifically withheld from ever becoming a rule any other broken man could invoke for himself. Other injured workers weren't so fortunate even in that limited sense. Some were simply deported once they could no longer work, sent home with nothing but the passage they'd been promised on the way in. Some, unable to support themselves and with nowhere else to go, ended up laboring on a charity farm attached to an insane asylum, not because they were unwell in the way that implies, but because it was the only institutional shelter the zone offered a used-up man with no claim coming to him. This is what the job actually cost, measured against one specific body: a trained man, 6 years of service, both legs, a letter nobody was required to answer, and an administration that answered it just enough to avoid the appearance of cruelty, while making sure the appearance was all any other man could count on. And MacDonald was one of the lucky ones. He lived. Whether he ever fully recovered his footing, in every sense of that phrase, isn't something the record settles, and we'll come back to what did or didn't happen to him by the time this project finally wrapped. The mountain that refused to stay dug. On the 4th of October 1907, a crack opened in the ground at a place called Cucaracha, and the mountain started walking. Over the next 10 days, roughly 500,000 cubic yards of saturated clay crept downward into the floor of the cut, at a rate of about 14 feet a day, slow enough to watch, too big to stop. Engineers likened it to a glacier made of mud instead of ice. It was the first major slide of the American era, and it convinced plenty of onlookers at the time that the whole project might genuinely be impossible. There were mornings, in between the slides, when the cut actually went quiet. Before the first blast whistle, before the shovels lit their boilers, there was a stretch of gray half-light when the only sound was birds working the tree line above the spoil banks, and a work gang somewhere down the line eating a cold breakfast before the 10 hours started. Men who survived this project remembered those mornings too, not just the disasters. The danger never actually left. It just went quiet for an hour, the way a predator goes quiet right before it moves. It wasn't a one-time event. Cucaracha kept sliding for years afterward. By 1912, it had dumped more than 3 million cubic yards back into ground that had already been dug out once. In January of the following year, it slid again and sealed the cut completely. When the engineer in charge asked what to do about it, the answer from the chief engineer was 5 words long: dig it out again. And Cucaracha wasn't even the worst of it. A separate deformation slide tore loose on the west bank, near the actual town of Culebra itself. A real settlement, with a clubhouse and dozens of other buildings and families living day to day inside it. The crack opened about 100 yards back from the crest, and it didn't stay still. Engineers watched it widen, day over day, and knew exactly what was coming. Crews disassembled the clubhouse board by board and hauled it back out of the collapse zone. They moved 30 other buildings the same way, piece by piece, ahead of ground that was visibly slipping under their feet while they worked. None of it mattered. 75 acres of the town fell into the canal anyway, twice the volume of material Cucaracha had dumped in its worst year, gone in the time it takes a hillside to decide it's finished holding still. On the opposite bank, another slide near Gold Hill added millions more cubic yards on top of that. Between 1907 and 1914, the cut experienced more than 100 separate slides in total. Some of them didn't just erase months of labor. They erased the machines and the men working on them in the same instant. Photographs from these years show 95-ton steam shovels half buried, flat cars twisted and swallowed, work that had taken a full excavation season to complete, gone in an afternoon of moving earth. Every one of those photographs represents a crew that had to be pulled off that ground, alive or otherwise, before the digging could even start over. Men who'd spent months cutting a section of mountain by hand, watching it vanish back into the hole in a single collapsing afternoon, and then being handed the same shovel the next morning to start over on what was left. Here's the part that actually matters for the number this whole video keeps circling back to. Every slide, every dynamite accident, every train death, every fever, all of it fed into a single set of hospital and payroll ledgers kept by the Canal Zone administration. And those ledgers only counted what happened inside the zone's own jurisdiction, using the zone's own definitions. Take a single ordinary year as a sample. The Commission's own report for 1910 logs 548 employee deaths, 376 of disease, 164 from industrial accidents, dynamite, railroads, electrocution, drowning, and a category the report itself simply labels other traumatisms. That's 1 year. Multiply that kind of year out across a full decade of construction, and the official toll, 5,609 dead, breaks down to roughly 4,500 non-white workers against 350 white Americans, a ratio that already tells you who this project was actually killing. But thousands of West Indian laborers didn't live inside the Canal Zone at all. Housing inside the zone was limited, and segregation shaped who got access to what there was of it. So plenty of silver roll workers and their families ended up in Panama City and in Colón instead. Both technically outside the line, the bookkeepers drew around what counted as canal business. A silver roll wage and a silver roll housing allotment left a man little say in the matter. If he then died of a fever in a rented room in Colón instead of a cot in an American-run ward inside the zone, there's no guarantee his death ever crossed into the official count at all. Some causes of death, typhoid fever among them, weren't even consistently tracked in the Commission's own disease statistics to begin with, which means a man could die of a documented, nameable illness and still not register as one more line in the ledger. So 5,609 isn't a total. It's a floor. It's what got written down by an administration that had no institutional reason to go looking for the men who died just outside its own paperwork, in a city its own jurisdiction didn't extend to. Historians who've gone back over the record generally agree the real number was higher. Nobody can say with certainty how much higher, because the very gaps that would answer that question are the same gaps that let those deaths go uncounted in the first place. The plaque says 5,600. The honest answer is at least that many, and probably more, and the difference is made up almost entirely of men whose names never made it into anyone's ledger at all. In cities the zone's own bookkeeping simply didn't reach. That's the number this whole video has been circling. Everyone already knows men died building this canal. Fewer people reckon with the fact that the people keeping score had every institutional incentive not to look too hard for the ones who slipped through the count, and didn't. What got built and what it actually cost. Almost nobody noticed when the Panama Canal actually opened, on the 15th of August, 1914. The grand international celebration that had been planned for years got quietly shelved. Europe had gone to war that same month, and the newspapers that would have run the canal's opening across their front pages were running mobilization orders instead. The cement boat Ancon made the first official transit, with no foreign dignitaries watching from the banks. 10 years of work, and the ribbon cutting barely made the news. What got finished deserves to be said plainly, without a hedge on it. This was one of the largest engineering projects in human history, and it came in roughly a year ahead of its own schedule, and $23 million under its own budget, at a total American phase cost of about $375 million. More than 230 million cubic yards of earth and rock came out of that ground, on the American side alone. It permanently rewrote how the entire world moved cargo by sea, cutting out weeks of dangerous sailing around the tip of South America for any ship running between the two American coasts, and it's carried a meaningful share of the planet's maritime trade every year since. None of that is exaggeration. None of it needs qualifying. It happened, on schedule, under budget, and it changed global shipping permanently. One laborer who lived through the whole 10 years of it put the other side of that achievement in 5 words, looking back on what the job actually felt like from the ground. Death was our constant companion. He remembered the trainloads of dead men being hauled away like so much cargo, day after day, and he remembered it decades later with the same plainness he must have felt at the time. Both things are true about this project at once, and neither one cancels the other out. The canal is real. The cost was real. Neither of those facts needs the other one softened to be believed. It ran directly on top of everything this video has spent the last half hour describing. The gold roll and the silver roll. Dynamite that went off on its own schedule. Trains that killed men quietly, one at a time, for a decade. Quinine that saved men from one disease while making them less able to hear the danger coming from another direction entirely. Slides that erased months of labor and the men working it in a single afternoon. And underneath all of it, a death count that was never built to be complete, because completeness was never anyone's job. For the 45,000 men who'd actually done the digging, the opening ceremony landed less like a finish line and more like a layoff notice. Work that had employed tens of thousands for a decade simply stopped needing most of them, almost overnight, and the zone had no long-term plan for what came next in their lives, because it had never been built around their lives to begin with. Some sailed home to Barbados, to Jamaica, to Martinique and Guadeloupe, with savings in hand, money that genuinely did buy land back home, and put children through school, and build something real for families who'd sent a son or a husband across the water and gotten remittances back for years instead of a body. That part deserves to be said honestly too, rather than folded into a tidy tragedy. For plenty of these families, the money that came back really did change what the next generation got to become. Some moved on again, chasing work to Cuban sugar estates, to Costa Rica, to New York and beyond. But most stayed in Panama, building communities, congregations, and eventually institutions of their own, including, decades later, a museum dedicated to their own history, housed inside a church that Barbadian workers had built with their own hands back in 1910. 100 years after the first ships like the Ancon brought them across, their descendants back on the islands they'd left were still gathering to mark the anniversary, still telling the story of the 20,000 who went from Barbados alone. Staying didn't mean the two-tier world they'd built disappeared. Segregation in schools and public life persisted in Panama for years after construction wrapped, and West Indian communities there organized against it the way communities do, through churches, through mutual aid, through solidarity movements that reached well beyond the isthmus and connected these men and their children to a much wider Black Atlantic political world. Recognition, when it came at all, came slowly, and mostly from the descendants and the communities themselves, rather than from any government that had employed their grandfathers in the first place. There's no record of a formal compensation program from either government aimed specifically at these workers or their families, decades on. What exists instead is oral history, museum work, and centennial commemorations back in the islands they'd left. People doing, generations later, the remembering that the official record was never built to do for them. And Wilfred MacDonald, his legs, when they finally came, arrived as charity, not entitlement, with an explicit note in the file that his case set no precedent for the next man who lost what he lost. Whether he lived out his years on the isthmus or sailed home with the others isn't something the surviving record settles for us. What it does settle is this: a man gave the canal 6 years and both his legs asked for almost nothing in return, and the institution that took them from him wrote down, in its own hand, that even the little it gave back wasn't a right, just a mercy, granted once, and not to be repeated for the next man who wrote a letter just like his. 45,000 men crossed an ocean, chasing the ghost of a man who came home rich. 5,600 of them, at minimum, never came home at all, and an unknown number more never even made it onto that list, because nobody with the power to count them thought it was worth the trouble. The canal stands. It works. Ships cross it today the same way they did the day it opened. The men who dug it by hand mostly don't have their names on anything. That's not a lesson. That's just the ledger, left open, the way they left it.